Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today we're getting into running back rankings for week 7 of the fantasy football season. I'll giving you guys my top 30 on the week, as well as some players that have missed out. Man, this was a really tough week when it comes to building out these rankings with a bunch of teams on bye and a lot of injuries. So what I'll be doing is taking it's early in the week here, recording this, getting this out to you guys on Wednesday. What I'll be doing is kind of taking a conservative approach with these rankings in terms of expecting worst case for a lot of these running backs that are hurt. Now, I will give you guys an idea of what to expect or where I'd rank some of these guys if they do play, but want to be conservative here to give you guys the best idea of how to build out your lineups. Today's video is brought to you by the STUNT, the all sports social media app. Brings together all of your favorite features from your favorite social media apps, makes it all about sports. We're live on there 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern time every Friday. I'm going to be able to answer all of your start sit questions, give you updated information on these games and on these players as we get into the weekend. Again, 4 to 5 Eastern time on Friday. Join the live room, get in the chat, or you can come up on stage and chat with me there. I would love to hear from you guys. I'll include that link to download the app in the description and in the pinned comments. Let's get into the top 30. We've got a new number 1 running back this week. Again, I'm expecting Christian McCaffrey not to play on Monday, so Kenneth Walker is my RB1 on the week, going to get up against the Arizona Cardinals. Cardinals defense is one that's definitely to be had. 30th in fantasy points allowed, 29th in run defense grade, and 28th in EPA against the run. Walker's volume has been really solid. The touchdowns have been there at a really high level, and we're not seeing Zach Charbonnet eating too much into his workload. At 2, Saquon Barkley. I know we're coming off a really poor performance against the Bills in that rushing department, but what I do expect is the volume to continue to be there, and Washington has not been as good as I anticipated them being this season against the run. They're actually dead last in EPA against the run this season, 14th in fantasy points allowed, so not too intimidating of a matchup. The Giants are at home here. I actually think they might win this game, so if they do, I think Barkley will definitely get the ball quite a bit in this one and find some success. 3 is DeAndre Swift. Look, this is definitely a player that I'm consistently now including as an RB1 on the week, running behind this Eagles offensive line, and now with the matchup against Miami, it's a pretty solid one for running backs. 19th in fantasy points allowed to the position and 27th in EPA against the run. So a really solid matchup for Swift. The Dolphins are a team that have struggled against the run all season, and I don't expect that to change here in terms of Swift's workload. He's been pretty solid in the receiving game too. In terms of his routes run and target rate, really solid for the running back position. At 4, Austin Eckler. Eckler getting Kansas City this weekend. Definitely a tough matchup for the Chargers, and the Chiefs have been really good against the run so far this year, or against running backs. 5th in fantasy points allowed. The run defense grade isn't quite at that level, 23rd in run defense grade, so it seems like the advanced metrics don't completely respect this run defense. Team that's obviously in a lot of winning game scripts, but Eckler back to being super involved in the receiving game, and of course going to be that number 1 back on the ground too. This running game has not been efficient. That's why I don't have Eckler higher. That is a major problem, but he gets uplifted in the receiving game and will get tons of opportunities to score touchdowns too in this offense. 5, Aaron Jones. Got an extra week here coming off the bye. I expect him to be fully healthy for this one. They get Denver, ideal matchup, dead last in fantasy points allowed to the position, 31st in EPA against the run. Look, there's no reason not to be high on Aaron Jones this week, because again, the bye week should definitely get him right, and a great matchup here. And I think the Packers can win this game on the road. 6 is Bijan Robinson getting Tampa Bay, a tough matchup against this Bucs defense, 4th in fantasy points allowed to the position, top 10 in EPA against the run. They're looking pretty similar to that team from last season, where it's just really hard to run the ball against them, but coming off of a pretty brutal game from Desmond Ridder, could see this offense be a little bit more conservative, could see Bijan bounce back. His receiving work is also excellent here as well. 7, Josh Jacobs. It's really hard for me to put Josh Jacobs this high because he has been super inefficient. We talked about him yesterday, and it doesn't really matter the matchup. And this is a good matchup. 27th in fantasy points allowed are the Bears. They're much more respectable in some of these advanced metrics, like 11th in EPA against the run. They're not too bad, but obviously an opportunity here for the Raiders, who get a Chicago team that'll likely be without Justin Fields, where they'll be able to run the ball and be in a good script to do it quite a bit. And they're getting Josh Jacobs the ball a ton recently, especially in the receiving game too. 8, Travis Etienne getting the Saints on Thursday night. The Saints are a solid run defense, 3rd in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 8th in run defense grade. So this isn't a fantastic matchup for Etienne, but he's been scoring touchdowns. He's being involved in the receiving game. He's probably going to see some decent volume here, and that really isn't something you can say about a lot of these backs this week that have a lot more concerns. 9, Brian Robinson. Robinson getting the Giants. The Giants are definitely a team you can run the ball against. There's 29th in fantasy points allowed to the position, 27th in run defense grade. So good matchup here for Robinson, and in positive matchups, he's been excellent this season. Get some of the down matchups matchups, you're not going to get quite as much as you'd like, but I mean, he's being more involved in the receiving game than I expected. He's scoring a number of touchdowns, and he's running better than he was last season. So a good matchup definitely means you need to have him in your top 12. 10, Alvin Kamara. I know Jamal Williams has been limited in practice. He's been back coming off of IR. I would be shocked if he plays on a short week. So I have Kamara here in my top 12, even though I don't think he'll run all that efficiently. The receiving volume has just been crazy. 6-7 receptions in a number of weeks here. But Jacksonville, 6th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. So it's not a great matchup. They're top 10 in EPA against the run. They're at 9th as well. So not super excited about Kamara this week. But again, receiving game will keep his floor really high, and any touchdowns could still go his way with Jamal Williams out as well. 11, Isaiah Pacheco, getting the Chargers defense. Look, the Chargers are in the bottom 10 in these categories against the run, but they've been pretty solid. Like this past week in the matchup with Dallas, stopped the run at a really high level. We're really solid. Now, Tony Pollard broke a reception for like 60 yards, had over 100 yards from scrimmage, but like against the run have been pretty damn good. And Pacheco is involved in the receiving game for sure, but he is splitting a little bit more of those opportunities than he is in the running game. So traditional running game might not be quite as easy, but the Chargers defense has been brutal. So there's a decent chance Pacheco finds the end zone this week as well. 12, Jerome Ford. Ford is probably an ideal buy low type of target right now. Probably not buy low. He did manage to find the end zone in one of those games. It wasn't too bad last week either, but like hasn't really exploded. And it's really because of bad matchups. And now he gets a great one here against the Colts. The Colts are 25th in fantasy points allowed to running backs this season. So definitely a chance for Jerome Ford to hit his stride here and become potentially a pretty valuable running back rest of season. Moving into our RB2s on the week, our top 24. 13 is Roschon Johnson. I'll touch on this a little bit later with Deonta Foreman, but basically I do think that the fact that, Darrington Evans got involved, that I don't think the team has a lot of confidence in Foreman, and really once Roschon is back here, which I expect this week, he will be their number one guy. He'll be that guy in the running game. He'll be that guy in the receiving game. The Raiders 21st in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 25th in EPA against the run. So pretty solid matchup against this Raiders defense to be able to run the football. We saw both Zeke and Ramondre Stevenson find the end zone last week, which is very solid. 14, Raheem Mostert. Some of you might be surprised to see him outside my top 12, but Philadelphia is not a team you're going to be able to run the ball effectively against. They're 2nd in fantasy points allowed, 8th in EPA, 2nd in run defense grade. This is a monstrous front. Nobody seems to be able to run on. I don't think the Dolphins are going to be that team. The interior of the offensive line isn't fantastic. They've run the ball outside the tackles really well. That's going to be really tough to do against this Eagles team. So I'm pretty low on Mostert right now. And then there's obviously the potential of Jeff Wilson's return, but Mostert is still a guy you want to start because the Dolphins have been able to be pretty effective with their running backs regardless of opponent, but this is a tough one for me. 15, James Cook, getting New England. New England's been 17th in fantasy points to running backs this season, but 3rd in EPA against the run. Again, I think that Dolphins game from earlier in the season really skews things. Otherwise, they've been pretty solid. We saw it last week with Josh Jacobs running for like 2.5 yards a carry. So Cook is a guy who's been super efficient this year. He's ceding opportunities to Latavius Murray. Still has the edge here in overall touches. So I expect that to continue in this New England matchup. And obviously, Murray's going to take some touchdown opportunities away from him, but I do think Cook is still a solid play with his efficiency and his ability to be pretty explosive in the receiving game too. 16, Rachaad White, getting Atlanta. Atlanta's been a huge team when it comes to defensive bounce back from last season. If you're still paying attention to stats from last year, you really shouldn't. 9th in fantasy points allowed, 2nd in EPA against the run, 4th in PFF's run defense grade. So for White, who's already been super inefficient this season, we saw last week a little bit less opportunities in the rushing game, a team that was trailing all game pretty much. This game will be more competitive, I think, which should lead to some better volume for White. I don't think this team wants to throw the ball as much as they did last week, but White will obviously have a little bit of involvement in the receiving game too. So still see him with this really tough week for running backs. I still see him as a viable starter in this one. Elijah Mitchell comes in at 17. Again, the expectation being that Christian McCaffrey doesn't play. I don't think that Mitchell will have the full lion's share of the opportunities here. We're going to see Jordan Mason, and I'll have Jordan Mason a little bit later in these rankings. But I do think the reason that Mitchell didn't get the ball as much as he could have last week when CMC left the game is because of coming back from that knee injury, wanting to take it a little bit easier here. So Jordan Mason was the guy that had the edge, but I think going forward, it will be Mitchell for as long as CMC is out. But Minnesota's a tough matchup, 7th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 13th in run defense grade, upper half of the league in EPA against the run as well. Their blitz packages really have them stacking the box, so it's a little bit tougher to run the ball effectively against them. 18, Javonte Williams getting Green Bay, an excellent matchup for running backs this season, 28th in fantasy points allowed to the position. Now, Jaleel McLaughlin had the edge in snaps, 21-18. Williams had the edge in the rushing game. McLaughlin was on the field a little bit more in the receiving game, so that will tell you what to expect here from this team moving forward. I still think Javonte will be the lead runner, and he was the more efficient runner last week. So in a really plus matchup, definitely I think he's a decent start for you this week. At 19, Ramondre Stevenson has the edge over Zeke last week in snaps, 39-23. He's the primary receiver. They're going against the Bills. Bills are going to be a very tough matchup for running backs or for this duo because of the fact that the Patriots offense has been so lethargic this season. Trailing in this game, I would expect to see Stevenson on the field as much as he was last week, if not more, being the primary guy making those plays and as the pass catcher and giving you some decent volume there. Otherwise, it's a pretty tough, it's not an ideal matchup for Stevenson. I don't expect too much this week. 20, Jaleel McLaughlin. We touched on the matchup being great. McLaughlin's been a pretty solid, efficient runner this season for the Broncos, but his involvement coming a little bit more in the receiving game. Guys, that's not going to completely take away from Javonte Williams. He's still going to run some routes. Samaje Perine's still coming in, seldomly to run some routes. So he's got to do a lot with a little, but there is a good chance for him to do that against this Packers defense. 21, Jordan Mason. Touched on the matchup here. Mason, I still think will be involved, and I think Mitchell will have the edge, but not a very significant edge. And when you get behind this 49ers offensive line and this 49ers offense being a significant favorite here, I think both of these guys can be fantasy relevant. 22, A.J. Dillon. We talked about the Denver matchup being great. Dillon's still getting those I-5 opportunities at a bit more than Aaron Jones is. So I think he's still a viable starter this week in a plus matchup because he should still see, anywhere from like 8 to 10 touches, and you could do a lot with those against this Broncos defense, even though Dillon's like one of the least explosive dudes I've watched this season. Big guy who falls hard and falls quickly and can't really get going explosively. So that's why I'm not crazy high on him despite the matchup. 23, Najee Harris. Look, Harris is a player that's really ceding the role he used to have would come a lot in the receiving game. It hasn't been this season. That's going pretty exclusively to Jalen Warren. So then we have to rely on his rushing efficiency. And the Rams aren't a bad defense against the run. 11th in fantasy points allowed is pretty solid. 19th in EPA against the run. I do think the Steelers be in this game. Harris could have some opportunities to score. Harris is going to have some opportunities to, probably see 12 to 15 touches in this game. And right now in this bye week, that's probably viable enough for you. 24, rounding out the top 24 in our RB2s on the week is Alexander Mattison. San Francisco, not an easy matchup for running backs. Such an excellent front seven. And the Minnesota's probably a team in this matchup going to be behind in this one. Madison's been the primary guy in the receiving game. He's been getting far more of the rushing opportunities. Akers has not really taken much of his opportunities away since his arrival, but Madison's been super inefficient since Akers has entered the fold. So maybe something changes at some point. I don't anticipate it being this week, especially with Madison, I think, being the better guy as the pass catcher for this offense. Okay, the top 30, some flex options for you. Some guys that are definitely a bit more difficult to start. Jonathan Taylor. Look, Zach Moss is splitting these opportunities with Taylor. Taylor has done nothing to make the coaching staff believe that he should have a major edge in the rushing game and take over as the number one option other than the money that he got from the front office. And Cleveland is a brutal matchup for running backs. 8th in fantasy points allowed, the number one defense in opponent rushing EPA this season. So expecting Taylor, who's been pretty inefficient the last couple weeks, to find that efficiency against this Browns defense is hard to believe. But again, it's a very dire week for running backs, and the Colts, with Gardner Minshew at quarterback, will lean a bit on that running game here. And it's not like we're going to see this Browns team really run away with this game if Deshaun Watson is out. That would especially be the case. So I can see reasons to start him. 26, Justice Hill. Look, it's a guessing game with these Ravens running backs, to be completely honest. Like, Gus Edwards was on the field more. He even ran more routes, which was shocking to me because Hill is definitely the better receiving back. But Hill was far more efficient than Edwards in the running game. So I think we could bounce back towards Hill this week. But Detroit's a pretty brutal matchup. They're actually first in fantasy points allowed to running backs this season, and they're first in run defense grade and 6th in EPA. So they've been terrific against the run. So I'm more leaning on Hill because I do think that better opportunities in the receiving game. That's why I will have him a little bit higher. 27, Kareem Hunt. Hunt had all 3 of the red zone rushing attempts last week. So I think that's a little bit telling hey, could Hunt be the guy that they're looking to score touchdowns? And it's not a bad matchup at all for their running backs. Indianapolis, 25th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. So I do think that there's a good chance here that we're going to see Hunt, kind of boosted his rushing opportunities last week, got like 11 to 12, that if Deshaun Watson isn't playing again, we're going to see some solid volume, and then maybe we could potentially see him having the edge when it comes to scoring touchdowns, and that could give him a little bit more of a boost here too. 28, Craig Reynolds. Again, I'm going off of, I know Dan Campbell said that Jahmyr Gibbs is trending in the right direction. It's hard to believe anything that Dan Campbell's going to say about Jahmyr Gibbs or about his running back room, especially keeping things a little bit quiet when it comes to these injuries and some sort of tactical advantage. But again, we're probably going to see Gibbs in practice. We're going to see Gibbs in practice this week. He was listed as limited, so there's a chance that he's still going to be able to play in this game. If he does, he's going to be a little bit higher than where Reynolds is. Baltimore is a good run defense, but I would expect Gibbs to have that lead role here, so he'd probably be somewhere in that like RB 19-ish range, probably around the Javonte Williams, Ramondre Stevenson area, whereas Reynolds, who I think with Reynolds coming in, they will lean more on their passing game against Baltimore here, and Reynolds will be kind of touchdown dependent with some okay volume that makes him at least good enough to play because he's by himself for a solid offense. Zach Evans comes in at 29 against the Steelers. It's a good matchup, 26th in fantasy points allowed to running backs are the Steelers, 22nd in EPA against the run. The team brought up Royce Freeman and Myles Gaskin. Freeman from the practice squad. Gaskin, they just signed straight to the active roster, and then they put Darrell Henderson onto their practice squad. So I think Evans is going to be the leader here. I don't expect, I think Royce Freeman will be more of that receiving back. I think he'll get some touches, but Evans, I think, will be the number one guy in the rushing game. And they really like to run the football when they get into the red zone. So I think Evans could be a major beneficiary there in this plus matchup. Rounding out the top 30, Latavius Murray. I mentioned the split that they've been having lately with him and James Cook. Damian Harris is probably out of the fold as well. Murray is the guy that can benefit from scoring some touchdowns. Could do that here in a matchup against the Patriots, where they should have this game pretty well handled. So it does make Murray a somewhat intriguing start this week. I don't think that the receiving work that he's had will continue. I do think Cook is the better guy there, but if you're taking what you saw last week, you could even have him higher in these rankings. So he's definitely a startable asset on this really tough week. Now, some players I have outside of my rankings this week. Zach Moss, I mentioned how tough this matchup is. I do think Taylor will still have the edge in the opportunities, so that makes Zach Moss a really tough start. Zach Charbonnet is kind of right on the edge here, is my RB32. We've got a matchup that's really positive for them against the Cardinals, but the volume just isn't at a high enough level for me to really justify getting him in my top 30. Deonta Foreman, like I said, the fact that Darrington Evans got involved in the rushing game last week for like 9 carries, I think that speaks to their confidence they have in Foreman as the number one guy. So I think Roschon comes in and Foreman really cedes a ton of those opportunities to him and kind of gets on the field in more of a change of pace, some early downs work, and Roschon should definitely be involved as the receiving back. But the rushing volume will be really high for the Bears with Fields out, I would anticipate, as they probably do not trust Tyson Bagent too much running this offense. Gus Edwards, kind of talked about the deal there with with things for the Ravens and how the split should go in a tough matchup. Antonio Gibson could be someone you might play against the Giants defense, but the opportunities aren't really at a really high level. Tyler Algier is definitely someone I don't want to start against the Bucs. He's just kind of solely reliant upon his rushing game, his rushing opportunities, and running the ball has been really tough against the Bucs. The Cardinals, nope. No, thank you. No Keontae Ingram. No, not against the Seahawks defense, which has been one of the best against running backs this season. I would not want to start any of those Cardinals backs this week. And then if I missed anybody else, I got Jalen Warren here as my RB37, Zeke Elliott RB36. Again, matchups aren't great. And I don't expect these guys to do a lot with their opportunities. So if I missed anybody else, definitely let me know in the comments. Happy to answer those questions down below. And again, we will be getting more into this on Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern on the Stunt to get into some of these injury updates, any changes I might have to my rankings, and then I can answer all of your start-sit questions when it comes to your lineups. Heading into week 7. Guys, if you enjoyed today's video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button as well. Subscribe to the channel. We'll have more fantasy football content all week long and every single week for the rest of the season to help you win your fantasy championships. Join us on the Stunt. I'll include that link down below in the description and in the pinned comments. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you on the next one.